All right, afternoon, Laurie. How are you?
G'day, Lucas. I'm doing well, thanks. Beautiful day outside.
Yeah, it is very nice since after all the cold we've had.
And I haven't had to turn the clock off. And
Yeah,
with a little grandson in there listening to something on Grandma's phone. So I thought I'd retreat into my so-called study.
oh, looks good actually.
Oh,
No.
thank you.
All right, so we're up to about John chapter 1, verses 14, and there's probably a few questions that come out of it, but I might just read that section,
Mm,
and then we'll just see how we go from there.
okay.
So the Word became flesh; he came to dwell among us, and we saw his glory, such glory as befits the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And then here is John's testimony to him. He cried aloud, "This is the man I meant when I said, he comes after me, but takes rank before me. For before I was born, he already was." Out of his full store we have all received grace upon grace. For while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God's only Son, he who is nearest to the Father's heart, he has made him known. It's interesting there. Well, I suppose first of all, there's that whole idea of the Word becoming flesh, but then in amongst that, it twice within that group of verses, he mentions that idea of grace and truth coming through Jesus, and then there's the whole question of the law as well, given through Moses, and then this Jesus being about the grace and truth. So where do we start? Like, what's your reaction? That whole idea of the Word becoming flesh is obviously pretty central to John's message and to Jesus' message.
I think it's central to Christianity. If it's what makes Christianity unique, this claim that that God actually became a visitor on the planet that he created and that he lived with us. And I was just thinking about it this morning. In Hinduism, the Krishna turns up every now and then on the planet, but he doesn't turn up by being born and actually becoming a human being. It's like he dresses up for Halloween or something like that. Comes down and does some pretty astonishing stuff and then disappears again. But this incarnation of God that is described at the center of Christianity is different altogether than that. And one of the things, Krishna turned up and he deflowered, was it 1,000 or 10,000 virgins in one night and demonstrated how great he was somehow or other by that. But that's so different. There's nothing that's about as close as it gets to God becoming a human being. I guess in myths and things like that, you have gods mating with females or males and producing half gods. We've got that in our mythology, but this is just totally different and I mean, totally unexpected. Who would have ever thought that having made the universe, that God would actually become a part of it? Just staggers your mind. So, yeah, I think this verse is central to Christianity and it contains the most astonishing news that we've ever had as a human race, that God paid us a visit.
When you sort of trace that idea forwards through the 2,000 years that followed, and you think about sort of maybe the way the world was before that incarnation and the way the world is after it, what do you think that that idea has made on sort of civilization over the last 2,000 years?
Rodney Stark's The Story of Christianity. I've forgotten the name of the book. He's written 2 or 3 books that look at, take a step back and look at the overall picture of Christian influence in the world. And one of the things he points out there is that before Christ, anybody who was in a power, was an emperor, for example, considered that everybody else was there for their sake, and that, you know, the wealth was meant to flow to him, and he lived ostentatiously and consumed it as much as possible, and then did a little bit for the public as a second thing. But the whole example of God becoming a human being to serve the human race. Remember, he talked about that specifically when John and James wanted the privilege of sitting on his right and left hand, and Jesus said, well, among the heathen, they expect to be ministered to, but with you, whoever wants to be great has to become the servant of all, and who wants to be first has to be a slave of all. And then he went on and said, for the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that was the model that Christianity brought into the world, that the very, you know, God is this, by rights, he's the supreme power, and he deserves worship and ownership of everything, but he came to serve us. And that's, I think, the most powerful thing in the expectation of the Western world, that our leaders are meant to serve us, that we put them there to do a job for the whole society, not just to get rich themselves. I mean, that, of course, that's the ideal, but there are people that live up to it.
That's a tremendous change, isn't it, from that Roman sort of idea of a hero, like the conquering emperor who will, you know, have a massive parade that goes through the streets to display all the people that he's defeated and all the wealth that he's gained. And that was kind of the image of success. Here you've got Jesus, who dramatically redefines what the idea of leadership is and what a hero is and what success is. And it's had a massive influence on the world.
Paul put it in his letter to the 2 Corinthians, somewhere in there towards the end. It says something about seeing the example of Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, that we through his poverty might be made rich. What an ideal that is, you know, for us to follow. And that's been the spirit of true followers of Jesus for the last 2,000 years. And that's got to have made a huge difference in the world, in the professions, in everything. That, when you have power, it's a delegation a delegation of power to be used not for yourself, but for the society, for others, for the world that you're part of. Yeah,
which is extraordinary. It's like it's really upside down, probably, to the way that we would think, you know, using our instincts. Yeah, very different view. All right, so we'll keep moving on. So then, what comes after that? He says he came to dwell us. He came to dwell among us, and we saw his glory, such glory as befits the Father's only Son. I wonder if that idea of glory there is actually the glory that comes through someone who is a servant, and not the glory of that conquering king. That God, you know, there's other places where it talks about God's glory being shown through Christ's sacrifice and his humility. What do you make of that idea of glory there?
That's one thing I have not got my head around. For me, glory means somebody who gets a gold medal at the Olympics, or the captain of the team that wins the premiership. And, you know, you look at somebody like that and you give them glory because they deserve it. They've earned it. And it's usually it's a sort of they carry with them something that's due to their success. And it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't figure with what the glory is that God has rightfully somehow or other. It seems to me like his glory is not just from success, nothing that's measurable from outside, but it's something to do with the kind of being that he is, to do with his character. And he carries that with him as well, but it's from, I don't know, an overpowering of God's grace. But then later on in chapter 11, I think it's chapter 11 in John's Gospel, where they're up at the temple and some Greeks come to see Andrew, and Andrew goes and gets Philip, and their request is that they would like to see Jesus, that his fame had spread so far now that people had come from overseas to Jerusalem, and they wanted to talk to him, to Jesus. And when Andrew and Philip spoke to Jesus, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified. What he was talking about was, this is the signal. It was right at the end of his life, in the last week, the last Passover in the temple in Jerusalem. And the coming of the Greeks with this request to see him was somehow or other the signal that this was now the time when he was going to be crucified. That does not fit. It's just, except that that's maybe the supreme example of the love of God and the kind of person, the character that he is, that he would show that much love as to become a sacrifice for the sin of the world, to bring humanity back into a relationship with the Father. Yeah.
Is this, Laurie, is this a redefinition of the idea of glory in a way? Like, is there a continuity with the way he's using the idea of glory here with the way that we've seen the glory of God through the Old Testament story?
I started to look it up one time, and I got as far as in the Psalms when they were talking about the glory of God, no, the glory of the temple. It was the golden shield hung over the edges of the walls of Jerusalem and catching the sun and shining, just a magnificent picture of beauty and maybe a little bit of wealth and, well, it would have been, I suppose. But it must have been a very, very beautiful sight to see the temple building and the ornaments and sun shining on it. Anyway, that was there in one of the places. That's as far as I got in that psalm, talking about the glory of Jerusalem. I don't know how that applies here at all. I just don't make the connection.
So John then goes on to finish that sentence off where he mentions the glory as befits the Father's only Son, and then talks about he's full of grace and truth. And then 2 verses later, he talks again about grace upon grace, and truth there. What's the idea here with grace and truth expressed through the Son? And I know that truth is an idea that comes up a few times in John's Gospel. When he has a conversation with the woman at the well in Samaria, he talks about worshipping from now on, not at this mountain or that mountain, but worshipping in spirit and truth.
Yeah.
And then Pilate, is it Pilate that says, what is truth at the end of this Gospel?
Yeah. Well, he asked Jesus, are you a king? And he said, well, yes, I'm a king of everybody who loves truth.
Yep.
And that's what Pilate said. I'll ask, yeah, that's enough. I think that where it says So the Word became flesh. He came to dwell among us. The reference there to the Word, the title of Jesus as the Word, who was with God, that after verse 1 and verse 2, or actually in verse 1, that's the first mention of this title, and probably John means for us to go back to that first verse and to get the continuity from where he's talking about the Word eternally existing with God and as God, and then you've got that in your mind, and it says, this is the one who became flesh and lived amongst us. He wants us to really grasp exactly who Jesus is, that he's the eternal God who always existed and who, was God, with God and was God. So immediately you've got a mystery there that can only be resolved in thinking of the Trinity, of God being not just in his unity, there's more than one person, which is a very clumsy way of saying it because it's a contradiction in itself. But anyway, this is a person who became flesh and dwelt amongst us, who became incarnate. And then that verses 14, or just verse 14 really, so the Word became flesh, he came to dwell among us, and we saw his glory, such glory as befits the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. He's got a kind of in verse 15, he refers to John and John's testimony about the greatness of Jesus. So you've got the connection there. God has actually become flesh, and the person who came, John the Baptist, came to announce the coming of Jesus, declares how great, in comparison to himself, how great Jesus is, that he was, what does he say? He comes after me, but takes rank before me. For before I was born, he already was. Referring back to verse 1, when all things began, he already was. Sort of John the Baptist is giving testimony to the fact of who Jesus really is, his glory as the Word, eternally existent. And then after that reference again to John and John's testimony, John the Baptist and the Baptist's testimony to the greatness of the Word who became flesh, that's Jesus. And then it says, he came full of grace and truth, was before John the Baptist. And then out of his grace, we've all drawn grace upon grace. And then grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Yeah, the theme runs through there. I'm stuck in my mind, Lucas, because verse 14, it's saying four things. It's saying, first of all, that the fact of the incarnation, that God became a human being. And then it says he came to dwell among us, meaning that he was part of history, that he lived here on the planet as part of our life. And you can't avoid the fact that Jesus actually lived and taught and died and rose again in history. And then it says, the Word became flesh, he came to dwell among us. And then John the evangelist says, and we saw his glory. It's the eyewitness account of actually John. He says we, I imagine he means the 12 disciples or the other 10 who were with him. We saw his glory, and then such glory as befits the Father's only Son, full of grace. Oh yeah, and then it describes their impression of knowing Jesus for the 3 years that they followed him as disciples was that he was full of grace and truth. And I imagine the grace, of course, is it's representing God's love and God's effort to bring salvation to the human race through the Son. He doesn't have to, and we don't deserve it, but out of his free favor, he has worked out this whole scheme of redemption, full of grace and truth. And I love that word, because what it really means is full of, it's the reality. What they saw in Jesus was the reality. And if you think about it, it's the word is all things. When all things began, the word already was there, and through him all things came to be. And his life, all that came to be was alive with his life, and his life was the light of mankind. You're going way beyond the appearance of things and beyond the science of things to the reality of what exists eternally beyond them. I think that's probably what, for me, this is what, when it says full of grace and truth, love plus, here is where, if you want to really know what the universe is made of and what's behind the universe, well, here he is, living here amongst us as part of history, the man called Jesus of Nazareth. Amazing.
One of the things that really captures me about Jesus is his ability to accept people fully where they're at, which is the grace. Like it's like the way he can relate to a tax collector or a prostitute, or even a rich person. There's grace, and just people were drawn to him because of that. They weren't afraid. They felt comfortable coming to him. But then with that, he's able to marry that with this truth, I think, where he has this clear vision of what life should be. And that's life restored between us and the Father and through him. And his life was full of truth because he always did what his Father called him to. But they're two sort of things that, I don't know, often you'll have whole movements of people who will focus a lot on the grace, but they lose sight of truth. And then the other can happen as well, that you can have groups of people who will just focus so much on the truth that they don't have any space for grace.
Absolutely. I think Pharisees represent there for the truth, but weren't so strong on the grace. And I know who represents those who focus on the grace more and ignore the reality. That's all tied up with selfishness, I think. The Sadducees were concentrating on keeping the peace and being very kind and gracious on the surface, but it was all for their own sakes. They were prepared to throw the people under the bus, save their own necks. I think in the modern...
And even you look at yeah, sorry, you go.
Okay, I was just going to say, in the modern church, there focus upon doing good, and I think that's great. And being sort of for every good cause, but there's a tendency to lose sight of the reality that I was up the street earlier and there was an old bloke standing at the bus stop outside the old church on the hill, and I was jumping into my car and I called out to him and said, "Hey mate, do you want to live somewhere?" And he was very reluctant to be helped. He was waiting for the bus and whatnot. And I was going down to the marketplace, would you believe it? And he wanted to go to the marketplace. So I said, "Come on, jump in." Off we went. And he was talking about how things were going bad and all of corruption in the world and everything else. And it was a good opportunity for me to say, just, well, look, the reason why I picked you up is here I got a car, and I didn't know where you were going, but I thought, if I was you and standing there at the bus stop, I would like somebody to come along and offer me a lift. So I figured that's what Jesus said. You do to others what you'd like them to do for you. Yeah, that led to the talk about corruption and whatnot. And I had to point out, if you took away, like Donald Trump says over in America, if you drained the swamp and got rid of all the sort of professional politicians who are in there looking after themselves, you'd put a new lot in and they'd be just as corrupted before long anyway. That's just the way it is. And I think that's the reality, that recognizing that the world's in a mess. And it's in a mess because of selfishness in people, whether they're in leadership positions or whether they're just, driving along the road and thinking about themselves and not somebody standing by the bus stop like that. Anyway, yeah, I think this is what we need to put together: grace and truth, grace and reality. Not to pretend it's different from what it is. It is what it is, but grace is given to us so that in the middle of it all, goodness can win, because grace represents truth in action. I think that at the core of the universe, God is love. And if we really want to be in tune with what's real, then we'll show love as well.
Yeah. Yep. But also embrace the truth that starts out with who Jesus is and then gets worked out in how we live the whole of our lives in line with his reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What I was going to say to you before, Lucas, where it says, we saw his glory, such glory as befits the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Verse 16 should start with, for out of his full store we've all received grace upon grace. John is linking together he and the 12 disciples of Jesus who were with him, their experience of him as being full of grace and truth. And then he's saying, we have all received grace upon grace. So he's counting himself, first of all, with the 12 apostles, and then he's counting himself as part of the church, we all. And he's saying that not only the apostles, but the early followers of Jesus who trusted the word of the apostles and became Christians, that they've also experienced in their lives grace upon grace to verify the witness of the original 12, that they saw him as full of grace and truth. I think there's a message there for us right now. We should be experiencing this grace upon grace as a church, as followers of Jesus. And that should verify for us in our own experience the witness of the 12 who saw Jesus in the flesh when God became incarnate and was full of grace and truth. Making sense? Getting a bit complicated.
Yeah, it makes sense. Why do people who are, part of the church not experience that grace upon grace though? And then they don't live out of that reality.
Yeah. Again, I think the answer is back in verse 5. The light shines on in the dark, and the darkness has never quenched it. There's always going to be opposition to goodness until Jesus Christ comes back. Yeah. And the opposition for us as followers is, I guess, to doubt the goodness of God, to doubt the grace of God, and to be harder on ourselves than God is. And every time I kneel in the morning and say good day to God, really, I feel how incongruous it is that here am I, aging kind of pensioner, finished being very useful in the world, and yet somehow or other God he favours me, he likes me, you know. That's the grace part of it, I suppose. But it really just seems, it's strange, every time it's strange that I would count for God. But that's the truth. That's the truth. That's reality. And that's what Jesus showed. And the difficulty we have is just not accepting that God is like God is. Harder on ourselves than he is.
Somehow we need to just be convinced and have that resolve and determination that to know that God's posture towards us is one of love and acceptance. It's just so easy to build up that picture that he disapproves, or as we disapprove of ourselves or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure of it. Absolutely sure of it. And John's letter, 1 John, in chapter 1, I think it might be chapter 2. Oh, yeah. Anyway, he says, chapter 2, if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we share a common life. That is, we share in God's life. We share a common life, and we are being continually cleansed from all sin by the blood of Jesus, his son. And I mean, I'm still a long way from perfect, and I still get my thoughts tangled up with darkness, and I don't act towards others with the kind of love that I should. And I posture a little bit, and not totally honest. All kinds of ways that I fall short. I know I fall short, but I don't even have to think about it. God is taking care of it because the blood of Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, has done whatever is necessary so that God's grace can win over my unworthiness. And just to be, I'm convinced of it. Just bold enough to believe it, I suppose.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's do it then.
Yeah. Amen.
I probably should wrap it up there. I think that's pretty good. I just noticed a bit that would be interesting to explore there at the end. He says, but God's only son, he who is nearest to the Father's heart, he has made him known. But we'll have to talk about that next time.
Oh, okay.
And then as it goes off into back to talking about John's testimony. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Laurie.
Been good. Bless you. Go well.